Tonight, we're going to be doing a talk called Situating Viking Age Memorialisation in Southwest Scotland and the Irish Sea Area. And it'll be presented by our lovely speaker, Dr. Danica Ramsey-Brimberg, who's joining us all the way from the US. Danica has gained her PhD from Liverpool University, having studied at Boston College and the University of York. And she's currently writing a book, part of which will cover the areas that she's talking about this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Danica now. And then remember, if you've got any questions throughout the talk, just pop them in the chat. I'll make a note of them and then we can go through them at the end. So thank you very much. And over to you, Danica.
Thank you to the Kilmartin Museum for inviting me to speak, and thank you to everyone attending this lecture virtually. Before I begin, I'd like to apologize for any mispronunciation that I might do, and to let the audience know that although detailed images of adult, child, and infant skeletal remains will not be shown, I will be talking about them and showing 2 cemetery maps. The Viking Age world was full of connections and lines of communications from Asia to North America and extended over a few centuries. People, ideas, beliefs, practices, artistic styles, and material objects could be transmitted over long distances, such as the Indian Buddha statue from India, the Irish bishop's crozier, and the North African ladle that were found together in Sweden. Yet people, objects, beliefs, and practices could also be transported over smaller distances, both by land and by water, leading to smaller networks with more intense influences and ties. One of these is the Irish Sea area. This geographical zone comprises southwest Scotland, northwest England, Wales, the Isle of Man, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. The most northern limit is the North Channel, and the most southern is the St. George's Channel. I typically define the eastern and western perimeters as being approximately 30 kilometers, or 18.6 miles inland, so a day's journey, to provide a focus on the coastal landscape. Within the Irish Sea area, interactions had been ongoing all the way back into the Neolithic period. The Viking Age, though, was a particularly vibrant period of continual movement and constant contact between local populations, newly settled populations, and groups that were more mobile due to trade, religion, politics, or a number of other reasons. In this geographic area, the Viking Age has typically been described as beginning in 793 CE, which is the date of the attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne, which is off the coast of northeast England, to 1066 CE, the Battle of Hastings, which saw the beginning of the Norman invasion in England. Yet these dates are arbitrary, with increasing archaeological evidence suggesting earlier contact and Scandinavian or Scandinavian-descended rulership or areas, such as Ireland, the Isle of Man, and parts of Scotland, occurring until much later. Throughout and beyond this early medieval period, a diaspora occurred in which not only people journeyed to different places, but aspects of their lives, cultures, and societies were also transferred. Within the Irish Sea area, southwest Scotland lies in the northwest corner and served as an entry point for raiders, traders, pilgrims, and other travelers to western Scotland, mainland Scotland, as well as further west into Northumbria and the Irish Sea area. Its location geographically made it a perfect landing and taking off place. During the Viking Age and the early medieval period in general, little textual evidence remains that can shed light on this period, aside from a few references to Whitorn Priory. Furthermore, the involvement of individuals from Scandinavia or with Scandinavian ties is only implied. We know in 798, Innispatrick, likely Holmpatrick, off the Dublin coast was raided, according to the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of the Four Masters, and the later Annals of Clonmacnoise. In order to get to this location, they would have had to enter the North Channel, passing Galloway, before taking a right. It also quite possibly means that raiding occurred in this area, akin to the rest of the Atlantic archipelago in Europe. There's also evidence of attacks further inland in Scotland, which would have required going through Dumfries and Galloway by water or by land. In 866, a mixture of Irish-based Vikings and Scottish-based Vikings invaded and raided the kingdom of Fortrue, which was based around the modern Moray Firth area. In 870, Dublin-based Vikings sieged Alclú or Dumbarton Rock in the kingdom of Strathclyde for 4 months, and returned to Dublin in 871 with 200 ships and slaves and/or hostages from different parts of Great Britain, including conceivably Dumfries and Galloway. Journeying to these areas could have easily meant going through or around Western Scotland. In 902, the quote, heathens were driven out of Athcliath or Dublin, abandoning ships and escaping, quote, half dead after they had been wounded and broken, according to the Annals of the Four Masters. Likely referring to the Scandinavian elite, they could have journeyed across the Irish Sea, going to the Isle of Man and the Eastern Irish Sea area, including Dumfries and Galloway. Dublin was later reclaimed in 917, and many may have returned to Dublin, with some possibly staying, but the influences from across the Irish Sea would have likely remained from this period. While not direct evidence, these do provide historical context of and evidence of continual interaction over the late 9th to early 10th centuries. It is slightly later that we achieve a direct reference to the area. The Chronicle of Man in the Isles refers to Magnus Barelegs, who ruled the Kingdom of Man in the Isles from 1098 to 1103. In 1098, the text states, quote, he, in reference to Magnus, compelled the men of Galloway to cut timber and bring it to the shore for the construction of the forts. Timber was a finite resource on the Isle of Man, which can even be seen in the propensity of graves being constructed of stone as opposed to wood. Though the exact circumstances regarding the quote, the compelling are vague, though violence or the threat of it may have been involved. This interaction provides further evidence of Irish Sea connections between Galloway during the Viking Age. Although the place name of Galloway itself is thought to derive from the word for foreign Gaelic speakers or Scandinavian Gaelic speakers, its origin and date have long been a source of controversy, with the word changing in meaning over time and space, with the term possibly not applying to Galloway until the 12th century. However, the Scandinavian place names in southwestern Scotland highlight the influence Viking Age settlement from various areas may have had, though caution should be always taken with dating of place names. One notable example is Tynwald in Dumfriesshire, which may have been the site of a thing or a Viking Age assembly, akin to Tynwald on the Isle of Man and the Thingwalls in Wirral, Lancashire, Orkney, Shetland, and elsewhere. There's also evidence of possible shealing names. So shealings were for pasturing animals and cattle for the summer. And we have 2 examples of that occurring within Galloway, although there are more examples up in Orkney, the Hebrides, Shetland, as well as further south in Cumbria, possibly showing contact with the area with these other locations. Overall, the area is thought to have had settlement beginning around the 9th century, land holdings becoming significant in the 10th century, and influences continuing through the Viking Age and afterwards. The degree of interaction can also be seen through hoards. Within Dumfries and Galloway, 3 hoards have been found that show evidence of Viking Age trade and travel via the Irish Sea. The Lochar Moss Hoard, which is now lost, the Talnotry Hoard, and the Galloway Hoard. They contain objects derived from different places, including Northumbria, Mercia, and the area of insular art, so modern-day Ireland, Scotland, and northern England, as well as Francia, the former Roman Empire, West Asia, and Central Asia, where Viking Age raiding, trading, and movement occurred. That is not to say that these are specifically Viking hoards. These are just merely Viking Age hoards, which was just talked about in a wonderful piece that was released from the National Museum Scotland, I believe, for the past few days or even today. There's also various single finds from the Viking Age that show connections. For example, the Dungeonin pendant, or Raric mounts as it sometimes is called, which features a blend of 8th to 9th century designs from Ireland, Scotland, and Northumbria, and was a piece of metalwork that was later made into a pendant. However, the gold finger ring found in Tundergarth, Dumfriesshire, has parallels to designs found in the Curradale hoard, as well as the now lost gold arm ring from the Hare Island hoard in County Westmeath, Ireland, that was dated to the late 9th to early 10th century. For the evidence of the raid's possible settlement and trade and acquisition of timber, we can see a continuous series of interactions from individuals around the Irish Sea area. They therefore establish a precedence of Irish Sea connections in Southwest Scotland that can then be seen in other forms of evidence, even Viking Age graves with grave goods. Within Southwest Scotland, several furnished graves dating to the Viking Age have been noted both within ecclesiastical and non-ecclesiastical contexts. While we cannot not be certain of their exact thought processes, alignment with a particular group, especially one with local power, could easily facilitate survival and even movement up the socio-political hierarchy and/or economic prosperity. Early medieval individuals and/or groups sought to establish themselves and their power and status within the changing multicultural landscape in which new ideas and practices were being shared and blended together. Furnished burials at or near ecclesiastical sites were the product of negotiations between the clergy and the laity to gain and display power, wealth, and status. At the same time, those that were placed in non-ecclesiastical contexts likely held their own connotations, drawing upon ideas derived locally as well as from their Scandinavian ties that were derived from their homeland or that of their ancestors or associates. Before I continue any further, I just want to establish 3 definitions. The first is a Christian burial grave is typically that of an inhumation containing no grave goods, oriented east to west, placed sabine in simple kissed wooden or earth-cut graves in Christian cemeteries. However, exceptions to this rule exist throughout the early medieval world, including Scotland. A Scandinavian pagan burial grave is typically an inhumation or cremation that utilized different practices and varied not just regionally, but locally in Scandinavia. Grave goods such as small artifacts, so tools, jewelry, weapons could be included, as well as vehicles, livestock, and even slaves. Although in some cases, we actually find no grave goods at all. Graves could be constructed from earth cuts to more elaborate structures using boats, ships, carts, or chambers. Therefore, as a result, elements of both the Scandinavian pagan burial could overlap with that of a Christian burial because the lines between them can be a bit ambiguous. However, some graves do not seem to therefore typically fall into either of these categories. A Viking Age furnished burial grave is typically an inhumation, though cremation remains a possibility, that contains grave goods from the Viking Age, and therefore it's different from the typical Christian grave, but it's not necessarily Scandinavian or pagan, even partially. In the Irish Sea area and elsewhere, the lines between what was considered acceptable may have been more blurred, and as such, all objects that may even indicate clothed inhumations, as opposed to shrouded, are included in this investigation. Compounded with the long, obfuscated process of Christianization, the line between Christian and pagan are blurred and hard to distinguish. Without time travel and a translator, knowing what the exact original intentions are unattainable. Similarly, who these people were, where they were from, or where they traveled is not possible to know based upon the grave goods or practices. Therefore, while I will discuss influences from different areas, I will be talking about how the objects are Irish or Northumbrian, not the people. Numerous ideas, practices, and objects circulated at this time and could have been acquired by all different people, much like today. With different practices and ideas being shared across the Irish Sea area, not only were Scandinavian pagan practices being transmitted, but those related to Christian burial practices were as well, which have been numerous times shown to be diverse by various scholars. And so there's possibly more that has yet to be uncovered or discussed further. I will be talking about six particular I will actually be talking about appear to be missing one dot on this map. So I'll actually be talking about 7 locations. The first is Whitorn. Within southwest Scotland, 2 Viking Age furnished graves are located at or near ecclesiastical sites. The first is located at Whitorn Priory, and the other at the former St. Cuthbert's Church on the outskirts of Kirkcudbright. Whitorn is a complex monastic site that is still under investigation today and has had a long history with prehistoric activity at the nearby St. Ninian's Cave. Whitorn Priory was a physically protected site, having been built in a hollow and near rocky outcrops on a peninsula, causing it to be invisible in some places. At the same time, it was easily accessible, with the harbor being located about 5 kilometers or 3.1 miles at the Isle of Whitorn, allowing the monastic site to play a crucial role in the Irish Sea network. Different individuals, ideas, and influences can be seen at the site at different points in time, originating from various political, religious, and social bodies from the Irish Sea area and beyond. From the early Christian community in the 5th century to the monastery's founding in the 6th or 7th centuries, growth in the 8th, and its dissolution in 1587, Whitorn Priory continued to be an influential center politically, economically, and religiously, and was linked to other areas. This is beyond the fact that St. Ninian, or Ninia, is attributed to be the 4th to 5th century founder of monastic community at Whitorn, and may possibly have had Irish origins. Prior to the foundation in the archaeological date, the settlement was already well connected and continued to be so, as evidenced by Mediterranean pottery from the 5th to 7th centuries, 6th to 7th century Gaulish pottery, 6th century North African pottery, wine and fine foods, as well as the 5th century Latinus stone, which features an inscription to Latinus, a Latin personal saint name, son of Barhobble, a Celtic personal name, and Latinus' daughter. It appears that the site was a key place of prestige in the Irish Sea and Britain, akin to cemetery settlements in 6th century Ireland. These connections continued later. Whitorn Priory was comparable to the other Irish and Northumbrian monasteries, such as Glendalough, Clonmacnoise, Armagh, Lindisfarne, Hexham, Hotham, Monkmoormouth, and Jarrow, with parallels extending to the ecclesiastical, political, and monument landscape in the 8th to 10th centuries. Whitorn's situation of being a Northumbrian monastery situated in a wider trade network across the Irish Sea is also noted by scholars such as Dr. Fiona Edmonds and Dr. Christopher Crowe. Whitorn became prominent particularly in the early 8th century, the same time as other churches and monastic sites in Northumbria, and could represent a reestablishment or new foundation during the, quote, golden age of monasteries. The multi-building complex was the foundation of learning through its monastic school and an institution of religion through its bishopric, and its being a widely known cult stronghold with the relics of St. Ninian, attracting pilgrims. The late 9th century Miraculae Niniae Episcopi, the miracles of Bishop Ninian, is documented as being sent to Alcuin at the court of Charlemagne, who wrote back and sent a silk veil for St. Ninian's shrine in the early 9th century. In the 9th century, a large fire occurred, burning down several of the buildings, including the burial chapel, for unknown reasons. Yet, Whitorn appears to have continued to play an economic role in the area, akin to the commercial activity at Iona, and was rebuilt beginning in the late 9th century, with modifications until its dissolution. The collapse of Northumbrian rule allowed Strathclyde Brittonic and Anglo-Scandinavian / Hiberno-Scandinavian / Scandinavian influence or control at the turn of the 9th century, paralleling other monastic sites. A preponderance of place names in architecture with Hiberno-Scandinavian or Anglo-Scandinavian and Gaelic elements highlight how 10th century Galloway became a diversely settled area. Similar personal adornments have been found at Mules, Anglesey, Dublin, and York. With clear ties to Dublin, York, and Wales, i.e. Llanberwrog, and influences from a Hiberno-Scandinavian and Anglo-Scandinavian area, Whitorn Priory was noted for its trade, industry, and manufacturing, including the Whitorn School for Sculpture. Its cemetery had a wide variety of burial constructions and special areas and materials denoting graves of high status individuals. This was an active time for the monastery and secular settlement, which appears to have had a population composed of Anglo-Scandinavians, Hiberno-Scandinavians, and local inhabitants of Scottish and/or Scandinavian descent. The placement of the Viking Age grave was not just burial at a high-status site, but also a visible maritime power center that was integral to both lay and clerical settlement in southwestern Scotland and the Irish Sea area, which is reflected in the facets of the Viking Age furnished grave. Originally, when the excavation report was published in 1997, the remains of 8 individuals were detailed as being uncovered between the east wall of the burial chapel and a line of rocks overlying fire debris, which represented a boundary from the previous period and concurrent buildings. They comprised 3 inhumations, one with grave goods and the other 2 with a cow forelimb, and 4 cremated adult individuals, and were considered unusual due to the nature of finding cremated remains at ecclesiastical sites, and therefore more akin to Scandinavian pagan graves, particularly as they were dated between 845 and 1050. Currently, the cremated human remains and the 2 individuals with the cowbone are being reevaluated, along with other skeletal remains by the Whitorn Trust and the Cold Case Whitorn Project, led by Dr. Adrian Maldonado and involving the work of scholars such as Assistant Professor Shirley Curtis Summers and Professor Derek Hamilton. As they appear to be more complicated than initially thought and possibly no longer strictly Viking Age or furnished, only one grave remains that is definitively a Viking Age furnished grave. An 8 to 12-month infant, grave 55, was placed in an earthen grave along with an annular amber bead and a roughly finished shale bead placed on its chest. Tentatively an accidental inclusion, the placement on the chest could denote a necklace around the neck of the remains. Grave 55 may have been placed here due to the proximity to the pre-existing burial chapel at Whitorn Priory, and/or because other children's and infants' graves dating to the 8th or 9th century, approximately the same time in which the burial chapel was present. It was also about this time a resurgence overall occurred in the cemetery of Whitorn Priory. Grave 55 did occur slightly later, but recent study proposes that nothing indicates a date later than the 10th century, placing this grave not just distinctively in the Viking Age, but also at a point in time when the placement of deceased children was still in recent memory, even if a temporary cessation in burial had occurred for large numbers of people. More furnished graves might be possible at Whitorn and in the general vicinity of the monastic site in town, but until such a time excavation is carried out, grave 55 remains the sole confirmed Viking Age furnished grave. The infant is akin to other aspects of Whitorn Priory, as it parallels graves found elsewhere within the Irish Sea. Although physical adornment was not commonly used, it is also not entirely unheard of, as early medieval Christian burial in Scotland was not uniform. The Viking Age furnished grave at Kirkcudbright, which will be discussed next, contained a small black or blue glass bead, among other grave goods. Other Irish Sea graves were with either a singular bead or multiple beads, or 2 graves at Carlisle, and a grave each at Concanhow, Tynwald, and Mackald on the Isle of Man, and St. Michael of Pole in Dublin. More importantly is the parallel to the infant and children graves on St. Patrick's Isle on the Isle of Man. In addition to the grave known as the Pagan Lady on the Isle of Man, which contained beads, another grave there included 6 glass beads, one from the 9th to 10th centuries, 2 amber beads, and a small conical bell with a small ring. While more elaborate than that of grave 55 at Whitorn, it highlights the inclusion of beads even in those of a younger age. Another child at St. Patrick's Isle also has 2 grave goods, 2 coins, while at Carlisle, an infant was buried with a coin. While they are only small in number, they reflect the practice of grave goods was something that could be extended to children and infants. The placement of the infant grave in this location meant that it was placed among other infants at Whitorn Priory, as well as next to the burial chapel, paralleling both furnished and non-furnished graves of the time period. Burial close to relics ad sanctos, or heavily traversed areas, meant that these placements within the ecclesiastical site held particularly immense importance and were prestigious. Several other Viking Age furnished graves were located just outside of the church at Workington and in Crockett-Howell in the Isle of Man. More importantly, grave 55 fits a pattern consistent with other Viking Age furnished graves at or near ecclesiastical sites further south in Northumbria. Unlike the Isle of Man in Ireland, these graves did not include weapons, but rather featured adornments and dress fittings or items of a personal nature. Not simply an interim phase before the monastic town, these reveal that the occurrence of events during the Viking Age that are far more complex than meets the eye, and that the site maintained a high level of sanctity. Kirkcudbright, on the other hand, features a Viking Age furnished grave in or near an ecclesiastical site that holds more in common with its counterparts located in the Isle of Man and Western Ireland than at Whitorn in northwest England. It was located at the boundary of St. Cuthbert's Church, just located outside the town of Kirkcudbright. Overlooking the estuary of the River Dee on an eastern gravel ridge, the town had limited access, but was in a strategic position for defense and trade, controlling key water land routes along the Solway Firth and agricultural lands prior to the early medieval period and then afterwards. Influenced by sub-Roman Christianity, the monastery at Iona, Bernicia rule, and Hiberno-Scandinavian, an Anglo-Scandinavian local settlement in control of the town by the second half of the 10th century. Kirkcudbright was an early Christian center with Viking Age ties. The name of Kirkcudbright itself, which transferred to an inverted compound around 1200, even highlights either a later Norse, Old Norse kirkja, or church, or English kirk influence. A Viking Age glass linen smoother was found near where the later St. Cuthbert's Church would be built in the center of town, which indicates a level of Viking Age activity or influence. During a politically contentious time in the 12th century, Kirkcudbright would become a power center with multiple ecclesiastical sites being built over its long history. Despite previous claims, the original foundation of St. Cuthbert's was located to the northeast of the burh, where a later cemetery still stands along St. Cuthbert's Road. Slightly more inland from the town on a major land route, the ecclesiastical site and those associated with it was strategically placed. Mentioned in writing as Kirch by the 12th century, a long-established community existed by that point, with an 8th century foundation that came to have a Northumbrian craftsman Whitorn School, a school for educating and training students or novices, and a mixture of Christian and pre-Christian practices. Aside from the cross, little archaeological evidence remains, with only several sculptured stones, including a baptismal font indicating the former structure. The dating of the foundation is based upon the proliferation of the cult of St. Cuthbert and Bernician rule, both of which began in the 7th and 8th centuries and would have ensured strong ties to Northumbria due to the cult and network of associated churches, including Lindisfarne. While the burial ground may have preceded the church and the minster, both were of an early date, establishing an ecclesiastical site intent on establishing a haven that would flourish into a town, taking care of the laity, and maintaining the presence of the church at a high-profile location. The furnished grave, which I've labeled in my research as Grave 1, contained a small black or blue glass bead, an Irish 9th century copper ally ringed pin, and a double-edged sword in a wooden scabbard, which in turn caused it to be gendered male and assumed to be pagan. Beyond the grave goods and the grave's location, not much else is known due to the lack of recording or survival of evidence. No known skeletal remains were found, or what materials, if any, to contain the deceased and their grave goods. With evidence regarding the exact placement of the grave is meager, and while noted previously as being within St. Cuthbert's churchyard near Kirkcudbright, this might not have been the case. As James Graham Campbell commented in his lecture, Whitorn and the Viking World, quote, "The 1880s extension to the burying ground of St. Cuthbert's was up the steep slope behind the old churchyard, so that this pagan Norse grave may well have been located outside, even if adjacent to and overlooking the Christian graveyard itself." This placement at the border of the cemetery means this grave occupies a nebulous zone as to whether it was inside or just outside the boundary. While the pin may have held close a shroud, the individual would have likely had to seek permission to be buried with the sword and the scabbard if the burial was in the confines of the cemetery. Even if it signified wealth, the sword and the scabbard are unusual inclusions within a churchyard for early medieval southwest Scotland. If the burial was placed just outside of the cemetery boundary, permission might not have been needed, and the significance of being placed by the church would remain, though not the same level of prestige as inside. Dating to the Middle Viking Age, the grave goods and placement do draw parallels to graves located in the Isle of Man in Ireland. 3 Manx Viking Age furnished graves were placed just inside the boundary, while 2 graves were placed just outside the boundary in Ireland. 1 Irish Viking Age furnished grave was placed inside the boundary, 4 just outside the boundary, and 22, 15 of which are located at Kilmainham, which is in Dublin, remained unclear as to whether being inside or outside. All of the Northwest English Viking Age furnished graves were distinctly inside, as was Whitorn. Burial outside the boundaries occurred at the cemeteries of Church Road, Lusk, County Dublin, and Durrow, County Offaly in Dublin, and expanding and contracting boundaries were present at Macwermouth and Jarrow, Dockra, Brixworth, and Islebury in England. So it may have been at one point in the cemetery, but the details of Kirkcudbright are too sparse. It would also just cement the parallels to the Isle of Man in Ireland, where swords were in graveyard churches. In light of either case, they underscore a trend that perhaps developed in Viking Age Ireland or Isle of Man, and then expanded across the water to places such as Kirkcudbright. While looking at the graves, the inclusion of the Irish ringed pin highlights a popular trend that began in Ireland and was brought over during the 9th to 10th century to the Isle of Man, Scotland, England, and even Iceland. They may have been used for clothing in life, but in death, they have been used on clothing as well as a shroud. In the case of Kirkcudbright, it may have had either in light of its location, but the important aspect was the inclusion of an object associated with Hiberno-Scandinavian dress. At the same time, Kirkcudbright marks the only definitive ecclesiastical site with a Viking Age furnished grave on the eastern side of the Irish Sea area to feature a distinct weapon. While other explanations exist for the spear in the Viking Age furnished grave outside St. Peter's Church in Heysham, the sword is a larger and more loaded object with its connotations and uses. In the case of Rampside, 2 swords were uncovered in the churchyard, but whether a church was present during the Viking Age remains unclear. Yet with a bull being sacrificed to St. Cuthbert on his feast day at St. Cuthbert's Church outside Kirkcudbright, according to Reginald of Durham's 12th century text, furnishing the grave may have been seen as acceptable prior to this in the 9th century. Kirkcudbright, like Whitorn, underscores that different ideas were at play here, and that practices and knowledge were circulating not just at the local level, but among the Irish Sea area, as well as prior to them getting control of Galloway. While both sites have ties to St. Cuthbert and reflect the political and religious ties between Anglo-Scandinavian leaders and the Church of Northumbria, they are also reflective of other graves in the Irish Sea area. The transmission of people, goods, and objects can be seen in graves not located at or near ecclesiastical sites as well. Within southwest Scotland, 2 sites possibly have 1 grave each that date to the Viking Age and align more with qualities associated with Scandinavian pagan grave practices than Christian burials. The first is at Ecclefechan, in which a type L pattern welded double-edged sword with 3 curved guards and a 3 triangular lobed pommel with possible earlier non-ferrous inlay, and a stamped pattern within a circular border on the central lobe was found in 1913. Little else is known beyond the find being Little else is known about the find beyond the sword, aside from it being on the western bank of the main river and about 9 miles from where the Solway Firth empties into the Irish Sea. Placing it here would have meant that it was near a key route and may have been visible by those traveling, depending upon where it was placed. The sword can be dated based upon the type to the 9th to 10th century, specifically 850 to 975, and may have Norwegian influences, though this has been debated. Typically thought of as an early English sword, swords of this type have been found more in Norway, as well as other parts of the Viking world, including Whelan, County Kildare in Ireland, and Paris, France. This suggests the sword is representative of Viking Age connections, including those to Northumbria and further south. We can see parallels to graves further south along the Irish Sea coast, such as the 10th century type W sword found on the Oyster Banks, about 61 meters, 67 yards, south of the vicarage in West Seaton, Lancashire, which is also not too far from St. Michael's Church in Workington. Furthermore, the placement of swords in dry contexts in Ireland is typically representative of burials, which could easily be the case here. The second grave is at Blackcairn, which is 12 miles northeast of Kirkcudbright. Uncovered in 1756, a cremation along with an amber bead and a late 9th to early 10th century Hiberno-Scandinavian silver armory fragment with parallel plain punched-in markings on the flat side had been placed into a prehistoric cairn and on top of the prehistoric grave composed of a stone-lined coffin utilizing flat white stones. The grave not only shows us, like at Whitorn and other sites, the Viking Age connections and transport of amber from places like the Baltic Sea, but also the economic connections between Ireland and southwest Scotland through the hack silver. Other examples of Hiberno-Scandinavian hack silver can be found in hoards, such as the Curradale hoard and the Silverdale hoard, both from Lancashire, and of course, the Galloway hoard. Examples were also found at Whitorn Priory. Furthermore, this grave lacks weapons and only includes dress ornaments, making it more akin to that of Whitorn than Ecclefechan or nearby Kirkcudbright. And the reuse of prehistoric sites is different from all these three, though. While Conkenhow and Balladule in the Isle of Man were prehistoric sites before churches, and the Viking Age furnished graves at Derby churchyard may represent a possible prehistoric cairn use, the Viking Age grave on the Isle of Skye is known to have involved another prehistoric cairn and creates a parallel. That lies beyond the geographic scope of today's lecture, so I will not go into it more. The last site that I'll talk about today is Barhobble. These sites are not alone. Another example of furnished grave at ecclesiastical sites, though it may be ascribed as being more late Norse than Viking Age, can be seen here. Barhobble, which is further north on the Mahars Peninsula and is just further north of Whitorn, near the coast, and is about 2 miles west at Chapel Finian, which served as a natural landing place. The geology of the area provided materials in which to build a small stream and lay within a previously developed enclosed and inhabited area, likely dating to the 8th century. Unlike the previous two sites, whether the cemetery or the church came first or simultaneously is unclear due to a lack of information about the site, including the first use of the place name. The first stone church or chapel was built in the 12th century, overlying a number of graves, and 11th century, though possibly 10th century, timber structures, including an oratory and a possible church, which is then repaired and more modeled in the 13th century until it ceased use in about approximately likely the 14th century. One of the wooden buildings was radiocarbon dated to 901 to 1148, while a fire pit dated associated with it dates to 891 to 1016. Similar dates were found through thermoluminescence. They are parallels to other late Norse structures in church and secular sites, and several of the pre-existing structures have been likened to those on the Isle of Man and Ireland, though caution should be taken. The stone structure incorporated several pieces of 10th and 11th century sculpture, suggesting an earlier site. Other different facets of the site have also been suggested, although these remain tenuous and cannot be confirmed as to how early the site was a church site. Although there has been suggestions that this might have been monastic, although it does remain tenuous, though it is interesting that there are several objects that were left either by locals or pilgrims by the altar, including white quartz pebbles, shells, and a stone disc. Barhobble is perhaps most notable for the time period of the Viking Age is for its pieces of sculpture, particularly that of the Whitorn school, and it may have been responsible for the production of nearby pieces as well. Some of the graves featured stones with patterns on them, but they are of unclear date, albeit paralleling those seen on the Isle of Man, including at Crockett. However, a cross slab comprised of two pieces found separately features a hammerhead cross dated to the 11th century. The decoration on this cross slab is representative of a hybrid practice, combining both the cross of Christianity and that of the hammer of Thor. The sculpture itself therefore suggests hybridity or the uses and borrows of different artistic styles. The cemetery itself is extensive, both being concurrent and to that pre-existing to that of the stone church. Overall, it suggests that it was an early Christian cemetery. And it had a number of cases of a range of orientations as well as constructions that were present at the site. Graves could be constructed with head boxes, charcoal, stone lined, one of which was tent or roof shaped, pillow stones, one even had a foot pillow, and another may have been shrouded. Overall, they appear to date from approximately the 10th to 11th century, although most of the graves cannot be dated, primarily because of the lack of skeletal remains and their survival evidence. So most of the dating was done with what could be obtained at the time period. Similarly, no coffin evidence of coffins are known, but rivets and small iron fragments were found, which could possibly mean that the wood simply didn't survive, much akin to the bone. One of the most interesting aspects of this is the fact that we do have evidence of a furnished grave dating to approximately the 8th century. So unlike both Whitorn and Kirkcudbright, we have evidence of this occurring earlier, although it does have parallels to sites such as Workington. Those that date to what's considered to be the Viking Age or the late Norse period 2, which is from 950 to 1125, there are approximately 3 potential candidates that are from this period. These include S14A, which contained a fragment of a heckle or weaving comb, had a capstone over the head, and was placed outside the church. The dating of the grave is based on the type of object, making it as unclear if it is from this date. Similarly, 2 other graves date from this period. One within the church that had a prehistoric triangular flint scraper, and another that's outside of the church to the north that had an iron knife and a possible silver wire fragment. Similarly, these dates cannot be confirmed, but could date to this period. Yet, the pattern of grave goods extends to the later period of the late Norse. This can be seen with grave 12, although in the excavation report it's labeled with Roman numerals. And I should have pointed out beforehand, the arrows point to all the areas that have that can either be ascribed to either the Viking Age or the late Norse period. Grave 12 contained a set of shears, which featured a stone-lined grave, was oriented east to west and located in the nave of the church near the chancel entrance. The evidence suggests this grave was therefore contemporary with the 12th century structure based on the fact that the floor was cut. We see another grave, grave 20, was stone-lined and had a series of small objects, possibly representing small tokens. There is another piece containing a piece of ancient Greek green periphery, paralleling other 11th to 12th century ecclesiastical sites, and as well as locations along Scandinavian routes and within Scandinavian settlements. This also had a headrest and was a charcoal burial. Although the practice of graves with grave goods was no longer upheld by this time, evidence does suggest that small items could still be included in the grave throughout the medieval period, and that some individuals were clothed, not shrouded, in the mid and late medieval period. Unclear of how to date these, both the original excavation report and others have interpreted many of these graves as Viking Age, while others have placed them slightly later to the late Norse period. Regardless of their date, the continuation of this practice may have been acceptable at Barhobble and shows continued interaction within Scandinavia as well as within the Irish Sea area, as many of these objects parallels those elsewhere. Shears have been found on the Isle of Man, as well as iron knives have been found throughout the Irish Sea area within Viking Age British graves at or near ecclesiastical sites, and other materials have been found with parallels. The burial evidence combined with sculpture and hoards suggest strong ties and activity around the Irish Sea area that were not just continued but strengthened during the Viking Age. Although not necessarily directly connected to a particular grave, sculpture provides a different form of monument through which ties to other cultures can be discerned, such as those around the Irish Sea area. The majority of the sculpture from the 9th to 11th century falls into the category of the Whitorn school, which I mentioned before, and therefore shows a stylistic trend focused on southwestern Scotland. An exception to this is the 10th century cross at Rockcliffe, Cumberland, which uses boar and yelling style designs, but as bossing on the circular crosshead like those in Whitorn. Some sculpture does exist that shows connections primarily to Northwest England, but the Isle of Man as well in one instance. The use of small and sized crosses in the 10th and 11th centuries occurred throughout southwestern Scotland and Northwest England, as well as on a piece in Middlesmore, Yorkshire. A hogback, which is a distinctive Viking Age sculpture, found mainly in northern England, that is shaped like a roof and served as a grave cover, can be found at Mosnow and Kirkcudbright, Fleming, Dumfriesshire. The hogback has design motifs and structure akin to various sites in Cumbria and Lancashire, and represents the only known hogback in this area, though examples can be found at in Govan at the Old Parish Church, which is further north. Most prominently different is the Kilmorey stone, which stands in the churchyard of Kirkcudbright Church in Galloway. The shape of the cross is the hammerhead form, more commonly seen in Carlisle and Lancashire, although I did reference that there was a form that was similar at Barhobble. The iconography on the front of the stone can be interpreted as deriving from Christianity and/or Norse mythology. In the case of it being Christian, it could possibly be tied to Christ and the cross itself, or to a vision of the Irish saint, Saint Columba, thereby highlighting an Irish Sea connection. In the case of it being tied to Norse mythology, it could be Odin with his raven, or Hugin and Mugen, or Sigurd at the forge learning the language of the birds. This parallels two pieces of sculpture on the Isle of Man, one at Ramsey and the other at Kirkcudbright, that feature similar Sigurd iconography. Other stones that feature Sigurd iconography on the Isle of Man can be found at the churches of Derby, Mallow, and Mackeld. The stone could also be used to convey a combination of these scenes from Christian and Norse mythology. The back of the stone, meanwhile, features a spiral scroll, which is more commonly found in Cumbria, and a chalice with a vine that is akin to a shaft fragment at St. Peter's Church in Hisham, Lancashire. Whitorn and Barhobble also feature a hammerhead cross, though with far less decoration. They are both incomplete cross slabs, but they parallel numerous others within the Galloway region. In both cases, they also further emphasize the blending of traditions with memorialization in the 10th and 11th centuries, although not blending the same ideas and practices as the Viking Age furnished graves. These pieces of sculpture highlight the Irish Sea connections to the south and to the west, as well as the blending of different elements from different subcultures. The Viking Age was a complex time period within southwest Scotland in which multiple groups of people interacted through different situations. These included raiding, trading, settling, and even simply using the land as an access point to the Irish Sea area, Pickland or Northumbria. As a result, people were impacted by not just the movement of people, but of objects, ideas, practices, artistic styles, and beliefs. Numerous forms of evidence exist highlighting these intricate relationships: place names, hoards, single finds, sculpture, texts, and even Viking Age graves. Particularly noticeable with furnished graves at or near ecclesiastical sites, they create a blend of practices that varied and shared similarities with different areas of the Irish Sea area and paralleled the places of which they were located. Influences could be expressed through grave inclusions, construction, location, treatment of the physical body of the deceased. We cannot be certain of the underlying motivations. The deceased and their kin may have brought their own sets of traditions, carried on those of previous generations who immigrated, or been influenced by others passing through or newly settled. We also cannot always be certain of where they are from or had been, especially in instances where there's little or no skeletal remains left. Nevertheless, the graves at Whitorn, Kirkcudbright, Ecclefechan, and Blackcairn embodied the diverse society that was forming and coalescing, and a wide range of burials were created, each showing a different set of traits to convey power and status. All 4 graves were buried at some point in the 9th to 10th centuries, which is approximately during and after the period of attacks on Fort True and Dumbarton Rock, and the exile and return to Dublin. It's also the time period of increased trade and industry and manufacturing and of designing metalwork and sculpture with styles and motifs inspired or transmitted by the Viking Age. Barhobble may also date to this period, but even if some of those graves are ascribed to a later date, it shows the continued impact and influence and control of the late Norse within this area of Scotland. A far more complex set of underlying political and social intentions were at play with the graves, in which individuals were trying to encompass more than influence intentionally or unintentionally with their memorialization. While a few of the commonalities may be coincidences, active decisions were required by the kin of the deceased when burying the dead, and though these would have been affected by the ongoing changes occurring in southwest Scotland. These graves and pieces of sculpture were not separate entities in the Viking Age. These memorials were multivalent entities in which were fully integrated into the religious, political, social, and natural landscapes, as well as the multicultural population. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Danica. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting, really interesting. And I will just go over to see what questions we've got. I don't know if Jacqueline's been writing them down, or do you want me to?
I have. The first one is from Patricia. Do you know anything about the hogbacks that are connected to the Picts? And she mentions that she saw a couple of hogbacks at the Meagle Museum in Perthshire. I wonder if you know any connections between the two, Danica?
Not that I'm particularly aware of, at least particularly with pictures design. I know that the hogback itself we first see it evolving during the Viking Age, but that's not to say that there wasn't particularly either Pictish involvement with design or particular aspects, but I'm not particularly familiar with those set of hogbacks. I'm more familiar with those, whether they're at Govan or further south. But I'd be interested in definitely looking further into those.
And I've got lots of people saying thank you very much. Really fascinating talk. Interesting talk from Susie, Patrick, Jeanette, Mary, and Hazel as well. I've all mentioned that. Does anyone else have any other questions at all they'd like to ask? The finds that you were showing there, are most of them in Edinburgh in the National Museum, or are they in local museums as well?
They're sort of a mixture. Some are more in the national museums, which typically happens when they were found much earlier, but other pieces are actually more in local museums. So they're sort of scattered all over the place.
Oh, right. And interesting enough, we've had a lot of glass beads that have been found around about Dunad as well. I've just been doing that with the children. So where do you think these glass beads came from? Do you think they were made locally, or do you think they were made in Scandinavia?
I think it really is hard to tell or hard to determine where glass beads are necessarily from. Usually it's at a site where you see some glass, potentially evidence of glass work being done. You can guess that glass beads from that area or from that area, but then it does get a bit trickier unless a particular motif is being used with them. In that case, amber beads or jet beads are a bit easier to determine whether amber beads are coming from the Baltic or jet beads are coming. A lot of times they're ascribed to Whitby, although there's a few other locations where they can be found, as well as carnelian beads are also being transported. So stone is a bit easier to determine than glass.
Yeah, that's true. And we've got a question, or someone saying that there's Kirsten saying there's hogbacks in the Botkyrka south of Stockholm. So there's some to be seen there. Kirsten's from that area, so that might be worth looking into as well. And Susie said, I wonder if it's just fair to categorize the Viking Age in the area as very busy.
I think so. I think there's a lot of it that I think there's a lot of, once you put all the evidence together, if you just look at a piece, whether it's just the text evidence or just looking at one form, it doesn't look particularly busy. But then once you put it all together, you realize that there's a lot of interaction and a lot of, there's a lot going on within the southwest of Scotland. It's not just all happening either in the Hebrides or the Orkney or Shetland.
Mm-hmm. No.
Although those are equally busy, far more based on the evidence available.
Right, I see. And Isla says the St Cuthbert's find are in the Steurty Museum in Kirkcudbright. So that's one of the local ones that you'll be going to soon as well, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And you're up there. Kim's saying excellent information, thank you so much. And Patricia's got an interesting question here as well. What got you interested in this topic in the Viking era? Have you visited any specific sites that sparked your interest?
My interest in the Viking Age started when I was much smaller, where I became interested. I was lucky in that when I was about 8 years old, my family took a trip overseas and we went to Denmark, and I got to see all the different objects and museums and stuff, and going to visit sites, and that started my love. And then it just sort of, it continued. And then when I got to university, I decided to go into history and wanted to study anything early medieval, and Vikings were, I really liked learning about them because of the evidence available, but also how many connections they had to all different places.
Oh, they're wonderful travelers, weren't they? And thank you. And Sue Dyke has asked, has any DNA or isotopic work been done on the Southwest Viking Age burial remains that give an idea of whether there's Irish or Scandinavian links at all?
Not that I'm aware of. I do know that there is being scientific testing being done on the Whitorn graves, but I don't know. I believe it's more, there's a greater focus on the later burials, but that's a question that would be probably better suited towards the Whitorn project. But as for the others, there's a lack of, with Kirkcudbright, Ecclefechan, and the other sites, there isn't actually skeletal remains. All we find is the objects. And so usually it's determined if there's a sword, if it's a sword that's not found in the water, it's a grave. So it does get a bit tricky in that aspect.
Mm-hmm. And Sue also says it's a great talk and looking forward to the book. So thank you. What will the name of your book be? Have you decided yet?
My book title is Viking and Ecclesiastical Interactions in the Irish Sea Area, from the 9th to, yep, I think that's just it. I think I got rid of the bit about the 9th to 11th century because the Viking Age sort of talks about that. But yeah. I'm still working on it, so it's still going to be a bit, it probably will not be released until either probably early next year.
Right, well, do let us know when you do release it, because we can put it on our website as well, so that, and also, you know, in our social media, so that people will be able to follow it up as well, because we do have a lot of followers on different places. Oh, there's another question just popped in. The cold case Whitorn testing has an early Christian emphasis.
No, that's how some of the, particularly with relation to the cremated remains that were ascribed to be Viking Age, that's how they sort of determined that, with aspects of like that it's not exactly as definitively Viking Age or pagan as it's been portrayed in either previous excavations, but that's due to the wonderful ability of science being able to do testing now that wasn't possible within even 10 years ago.
Yeah, there's been amazing moves forward. We've used that a lot, and we talk about it a lot when we do bone detectives with children, and you know, we talk about the it's amazing what you can find out now compared to what you could before. So yeah, is there any more questions from anybody at all? Well, thank you very much, Danica. That's been great. Anybody who wants to look back on this, I would say in maybe about 3 weeks' time, this will be available on our YouTube site as well. And so if they want to follow up on that. So I think everyone would like to say thank you very much to you, Danica. That was great. And there's lots, so you can probably read the comments. There's lots of people popping in there to saying how much they've enjoyed it. And thank you. It's a great talk.
Well, I'm glad that they enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And just to let everybody know that the next talk that we're going to do this evening, we'd love to hear your comments about this talk as well. So if you've got any suggestions for further talks you'd like to hear, if you could email us, and if you would like to make a donation to our museum, there's a link on our website. So if you'd like to do that. And our next talk is about the Bronze Age. So we're going back in time. Sacrifice, scrap or something else, practices of metalwork deposition in late Bronze Age Britain and Ireland with Dr. Matthew Knight from the National Museum. So there's lots to look forward to, and if you want to see any of our previous talks, they're on our YouTube channel as well. But thank you very much, all the way from America. Thank you very much, Danica.
Thank you, Danica. And
thank you for having me.